the irony is that you're on the front cover of what are called men's health style magazines, and there's virtually nothing healthy about how that person looks. You'll never see me on social media saying, that's idiotic, that's stupid, they've got this wrong. Is that, the great thing about science is that it keeps evolving. And I like that phrase, to the best of our knowledge. I know there's controversy here, but the suggestion that protein intake should be split evenly throughout the day. And a big mistake a lot of people tend to do is backload the day.
Hi there, and welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now, my name is Dr. Steve Ingham, performance scientist by trade and training. And in these discussions with performance experts, practitioners and performers, I explore how we deliver performance, how we support others to perform, and the underpinning knowledge and concepts at play. I really hope you enjoy the conversations from today's episode or from the back catalogue. And if you do, it'd be great if you can take a chance to like and subscribe to the channel, or for the audio, take a moment to leave a review. It really helps the show. Right, let's get into the discussion.
All right, folks, well, welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now, today I'm joined by Professor Graeme Close. Now, Graeme is a former professional rugby league player, now a Professor of Human Physiology at Liverpool John Moores University. Now, Graeme expertly combines his academic research with applied physiology and nutrition consultancy for some of the world's premier sporting organisations. He's consulted for England Rugby, Everton Football Club, as well as leading golfers and jockeys. To top it all off, now Graeme is a qualified S&C coach, so he's got some incredible breadth to bring to this conversation. Welcome, Graeme. How are you?
Marvellous, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to where we go today.
Oh, amazing. Look, I've given a bit of a background there to you, but could you, maybe in two parts, I'd love, because you've got this incredible academic career, but you've also got this incredible focused consultancy. Maybe in two parts, could you just give us a bit of a summary to your background and journey? Maybe let's start with the academic side first of all, and then I'll ask you about your applied work.
Yeah. It all started by accident, if I'm being completely honest, Steve.
Right.
So I was trying to be a professional rugby league player back in the mid-90s, and in 1995 the game went full-time professional. So I'd turned down a university place. I never intended coming to university. But I found myself that we were training in the morning and then again in the evening with nothing to do during the day, because at that point some of the players hadn't become full-time. So we had to train at both ends. So it was almost a threat to our head coach. Look, I'm a bit bored. Can we do something during the day? I could have gone to university. Not realising he's an ex-school teacher. He said, what a great idea, go and do university. We'll fit it in. So I went off to do a sports science degree. Wasn't really enjoying it until the third year when I met Professor Don McLaren, who's the same as me really, a nutritionist / academic / consultant. And the research project I did with him kind of changed my life. And I guess that's one of my first lessons I tell people, which is get a good mentor and cling on to them.
Yeah, right. When someone like Don McLaren.
Yeah, Don changed my life. So I kept going, and I did a PhD with Don. And at that point, my rugby career wasn't going as well as I wanted. And that was it. That was the start of the academic journey. And here I am today.
Yeah, wow. Okay. So that's so interesting. Just, probably you're interested in sport, probably interested in the science of it, but you didn't have that spark until you met Don. What was that? What was it about Don, or the words he would say, or the behaviours, or his insights? What was it that really got your motivation going?
I think with Don, there was two things. One was his wealth of knowledge. It was mind-blowing. You would sit there and this just fountain of information came out that was seamless. He could stand in front of a whiteboard and draw metabolic pathways. And then he'd switch and he'd talk about at the weekend working with Sale Sharks or working with Everton, or he would then be able to contextualize it in elite sports. And that really was like, okay, I can do both here. It was the first time that I realized there was a way of combining cutting edge sports science with applied practice. So yeah, it was that inspiration to do what I now do, I hope.
Yeah. That's incredible. That's incredible to hear. And I wonder whether it's becoming rarer, whether you do one or the other. To combine the twos seems to be a novelty these days.
I think it is. I also think we forget sometimes as university academics that our job is to light a flame in our students and then let it burn. And I, no matter how down I'm feeling or if I'm having a bad day or whatever, I've still got this little mantra that the second I walk through that classroom door, my job is to inspire. My job is to get them excited about my subject discipline. And if I'm not excited, they're not going to be. And the more I think us university academics can keep that at the back of our mind, that that's what our job is. Yes, we're about research and innovation, but ultimately, I think we're about, lighting fires in students and letting them burn.
I love that, Graeme. And you know what? I think that's a novel approach in itself. I'm not to speak ill of academics around, but I do hear a tidal wave of the trouble with students is, and I always think of that Benjamin Zander, the conductor, is an incredible TED talk. If people haven't watched it, it's fabulous. It's so emotive. So he plays a wonderful piece of music, Chopin and so on. But he's basically saying, if my orchestra's not performing, I shouldn't be blaming them. And he will say, who am I being if my players' eyes are not shining? that in itself is incredible to hear that you're focused on inspiring people.
Why, a few years ago, we wrote, myself and James Morton, we wrote this master's degree in sport nutrition. And I remember sitting down with James when we was talking about what is the purpose and what do we want, what is our vision. And our vision at that time was that we wanted to look in elite sports and see the footprint of the LJMU Masters everywhere. And we're about a decade on from that now. And I look around, whether it's, Premier League, rugby, football, cricket, tennis, throughout the world. We talked about it throughout the UK. We've seen it throughout the world. And that's probably my proudest achievement in my academic career. People ask you what's your best paper or what's your best bit of consultancy. But my proudest achievement is, I look at Manchester City, Manchester United, you look everywhere and you're like, they came through the JMU Masters, we lit that flame that got them excited. And they've gone on and done outstanding work. So you can get lots of satisfaction from that. So it's not all altruistic. There's a lot of personal pride there as well.
Yeah. Hey, look, let's not turn this into a JMU advert. But I would, if people say to me, where do I want to study sports nutrition? I would go, okay, go to Liverpool. So you get my thumbs up, at least for now.
Appreciate that.
So so tell me about your kind of applied work then. So you've got this sort of academic pursuit and you have this flavour of looking at real life nutritional habits, but really pursuing the in-depth self-signaling mechanistic pathways, what's going on. So it's not just the surface level, habits of nutrition. And you're applying that into the world of elite sport. How did your applied career begin?
Yeah, my applied career started with Munster Rugby, really, over in Ireland. And that came from a former teammate of mine, actually the late Paul Derbyshire, sadly passed away to motor neuron disease about 10 years ago. And ironically, that MND is now an area that I want to focus some of my research moving forward. Probably because of that. But Paul Derbyshire was the head of strength and conditioning at Munster Rugby, needed some nutrition support and knew what I did. And because of that teammate connection and that trust that you get from sharing a field, Paul took me over to Munster, and talk about a baptism of fire in that is still probably the most elite of all environments I've ever been in. So right in at the pinnacle, I would say. When I walked in, people who are familiar with rugby, it was people like Paul O'Connell, Ronan O'Gara, Peter Stringer, real legends of the game. I'll never forget that day one, Steve, I get in there and Paul O'Connell pulls me to one side. We sit down for a coffee, welcomes me to the club, tells me a little bit about the culture of Munster Rugby, what the club means to them, what it means to the community, what they're looking for, what success would look like, and as captain, offering me every support he could possibly give me. And it blew me away. And actually,
how unusual is that?
I've still never been in an environment where a leader has done that. And I think that probably summarises why that club, particularly in that era, are unbelievable. And it probably also summarises why Ireland rugby are doing so well at the moment. That, Paul and people like that are involved in that setup and that culture. And yeah, what a great start to my applied world that was.
Yeah, okay. So you started from a point of view of thinking, wow, this is really inspiring, this is really engaging. And well, I mean, I don't know how frequently you encounter that, but like I say, that sounds like a rarity to engage support staff in such a positive way at the start of your career. And how have you evolved that over the time?
Yeah, so an opportunity then came up, which was like a chance in a lifetime to work with the England Rugby national team. And that was probably the main reason why I moved away from Munster. Also, and I've done this in a few places now, Steve, I go in there as a consultant, try and get them excited about nutrition, and then say, right, you're ready for full-time support. And obviously being a university academic, that's not me. So, and with Munster, I put one of my former students in, and then they went full-time. So this opportunity came up with England Rugby to go into there as a consultant. Working in the sport that you love at the national team was, again, something I just couldn't turn down. And then I was fortunate that I had 10 great years, 3 World Cups working with England Rugby. But in a similar scenario, I think I took it to a point where it was ready for full-time support. So after this World Cup just gone in France, I've stepped aside. One of my former students, James Moorhen, has stepped into there now into a full-time capacity. I've kept a small role to sit on the RFU Research and Innovation panel, and I'm there for all the nutritionists within the RFU. But the actual hands on the tools now, I've passed on the baton, and it's great to watch my former students fly. And I've got another former student who's doing the England ladies team as well. So yeah, it's been a really exciting journey, that one.
And so give us some of your insights in terms of the type of work that you're doing for the England setup, and presumably, perhaps in some ways, one of your key statements in your papers about training nutrition and competition nutrition. Presumably, there's a big split in terms of you're preparing players day in, day out, or you're helping them in liaison with clubs, but you're also getting them ready for big competition performances.
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest challenge that you've got with international rugby, that you're basically borrowing players, aren't you, for a short period of time. So one thing I really tried to do a lot in my role is build great relationships with the clubs, and that involved getting in the car and going visiting the clubs, but also offering support, wider support to the club if they needed it, rather than just the 2 or 3 international players that was in that. And hopefully, I built some nice relationships, and I've got friendships that are still live today. You're right in terms of that training and competition nutrition, and I think that's one key thing that people get wrong. A good example of this was, we go back a few years now. There was an article in the paper that England rugby players were overweight because they eat too much carbohydrate, and it gave an example of a day's food intake, and it was about the 8 gram per kilogram body mark of carbohydrate. You go forward about a week later, there's another article in the newspaper saying we got beat to Wales because we don't eat enough carbohydrate. And there was an article and it showed a typical day's intake when it was quite a low carbohydrate intake. Now, all I can think of is that a journalist had access, maybe on a rest day when it was quite a low carbohydrate day, and another journalist got access on a day when it was a game day -1. We're now in game mode and we're loading ready for game day. And we're thinking that that's how we eat all the time. So the reality is the way we eat changes on a day by day, even by meal basis. My colleague James, who I mentioned it a couple of times, James Morton, we together wrote this paper around about carbohydrate periodization. James leads that aspect of our work here, and we call it fuel for the work required. So this is that concept of the fuel mainly being the carbohydrate. Demands will change dependent on where you are in the week and the training that's coming. But I don't think enough people get that nuance. And what they want to do is eat out of habit and eat the same way every day, regardless of what they're doing. So, yeah, that's a great point to pick up already, which is that difference between training and competition.
And why is that? Is that why would people do that? Is that something related to hunger, habit, in terms of, I normally eat this, therefore I've got to change, or it's less today, but I've actually got some hunger, and that drives, I guess, closer to the mean. People get closer to what they normally do. What's the underpinning habits behind that?
Yeah, I think habit is a big one, especially when you're working with athletes, because what you'll find with athletes, people talk about superstition with athletes, and I don't think it's superstition. I think often it's they've got into good routines.
Yeah.
And, I look back on my playing days, and people used to think I was superstitious because I would always get dressed for a game in the exact same order, including putting my shirt on just as I got to the door. But when I look back on why I did that, it was the amount of times that maybe I forgot to do something. Maybe I forgot to put my mouth guard, or, forget. So by doing it in the same order, you get into a routine. And why did I put my shirt on very last minute? Well, I hated being warm in the dressing rooms. So it was always people thought it was a superstition, but it wasn't. It was a routine. And I think that's what happens a lot with athletes, that they develop routines. So they have maybe found a way of eating that has got them to where they are. And then what happens then is that come along at the elite end when we're trying to squeeze out them 1%, and that might involve changing some things. So an example here, and this isn't only a theory of mine, and maybe I'm going to go a bit controversial here, but often in rugby,
go rogue, Graeme. Come on,
yeah,
let's have it. Come on.
Well, often in rugby, we're asked to help, let's say, front row forwards who are maybe on the heavier side of what an athlete would be. But now what I think we're doing is overturning habits of a lifetime. So these are athletes who have actually found a sport where being that little bit heavier actually fits with the lifestyle that they're in, maybe it fits with their hunger, their lifestyle. And it's actually got them to be elite international athletes. And then I come along and say, right, let's change exactly what you're doing, and let's try and get you a little bit leaner, and let's work on your body composition. And now we're trying to undo, habits that have maybe developed from 10 years of age. And I don't think often we think about the person enough and the backstory. And that was a big thing that certainly towards the end of my consultancy, I really did try and understand the individual a lot more than the numbers. And actually, when you understand the individual, I think you're much more capable of making them changes you want.
Okay, so behavior change psychology, setting up your interactions with athletes. Is that what I'm hearing there?
That behavior change is a big buzzword at the moment, and there's lots of models around it. But for me, it comes back down to, understanding the individual, understanding the why, what are their drivers, what's their lifestyle, what's their home life. And ultimately, when I talk about at the beginning, lighting a flame in students and showing that you care about the subject, well, I think when it's with athletes, it's making sure that they know you care about them as an individual. And I find that a little bit of a challenge sometimes in my world, because you're employed by a club. So they're actually your employer, but my priority is the athlete. And sometimes there can be some conflict there. But ultimately, I make sure the club know that, my confidentiality lies with the athlete. It's the only way my world works. And I make sure the athlete's aware of that. And I also, like I say, go back to making sure that, I care about them as an individual, and you go that extra mile. And normally you'll find your life becomes much easier when we do know that your heart is in the right place, which is them.
I think my reflection is of perhaps when I was a younger practitioner supporting athletes, I'd try as much as I could to sound authoritative, know what I'm doing. But you end up sort of pushing maybe a little bit more certainty in your advice, when actually, I guess with some years of experience and some reputation in your work, you can pull back a little bit and go, there's a probabilistic aspect to this. And what works for you now might not necessarily work for you in the future. You can put some disclaimers in there, can't you, that actually set you up later in life, later in their career for some of those changes, rather than necessarily expecting an athlete to be thinking, how do I evolve? How do I adapt? You might be able to play that agenda early on.
Yeah, no, it's a good story, and I use it as one of my lectures with the students. When I taught at my first ever gig was Munster Rugby, or my first big gig. I'd worked at some local rowing clubs and things like that. But this was my first real break. And I was asked to give a presentation. And I'd written I need to show it you one day, Steve. It was basically a biochemistry lecture.
Nice.
That was part of my lack of confidence, that I wanted them to know how much I knew. And in the back of my mind, I was even thinking, it doesn't really matter if I lose them for a second. They need to know how sharp I am as an individual. Whether you believe in God or whatever, somebody was looking down on me because the projector didn't work. So I just had to stand in front of the players and just introduce myself. And that was probably the best thing that happened, because rather than talk about science, I talked a little bit about me and what I was there to do. And I wonder what would have happened to my career should I've given that science lecture. And I think the lesson there is that you need to know your science, of course you do, but you don't need to put it in people's faces. You need to actually be able to get simple advice. And it often surprises young practitioners. I was mentoring someone this week who's going into a very elite football team, and he was really nervous about it. And I was like, don't be. You will see that actually the big wins are the absolute fundamentals. Even at the elite Premier League end, there's so many big wins that are just still not being implemented. So I don't know. Did you see that paper we've just written? Andy Casper was a lead author.
No, go on.
And what we looked at was, us academic boffins sit in our laboratories pontificating of, do we need 90 or 100 grams per hour of carbohydrate? So how do we really, squeeze the dial? So we measured the carbohydrate intake, and Andy did a great job of weighing everything in a Premier League football game. Absolutely everything. Averaging about 10 grams an hour of intake. So we're pontificating, how do we get from 80, 90, 100? When the reality is, just get some in you. We're not getting anything in them. 10 grams. And there's massive wins to be made there just by actually getting the fundamental nutrition right. So people always look for that 1% as, the old marginal gains. But they forget that marginal gains only works once you fix the massive gains.
Yeah. And you know what that reminds me of? This is we're at risk of sort of going, back in the day. But I worked at Worcester Sports Performance Centre, and that was West Midlands Sports Council in the 90s, so 97 to 98. And then I'm working with the British Olympic rowing team, and I'm away on training camps with them. And so 6 months into my gig with the Olympic team, and obviously, back in the 90s, that was riddled with champions. And they said, can you do a bit about hydration for altitude training on an altitude training camp? And I was like, yeah, sure, okay. And I forgot last minute, I hadn't prepared for it. So I grabbed my overhead projector slides from the presentation that I'd done for Hereford under-16 hockey team, which I had pitched at, you know what, I don't think they know anything about hydration. I don't think they know why it's important. Here's why it is. Here's how you can just get started with it. Here's how to do some advanced stuff with it. And here's some of the habits that people, the complaints that people make, like I'm weeing a lot more than normal, that type of thing. So I took them with me, and I ended up just thinking, you know what, I'm just going to try and use them. But with a real demon in my head going, you're presenting the under-16 Hereford hockey team hydration strategy to British Olympic champions, thinking, is that the right level? And it was one of those moments I've just thought, oh, okay, I might have actually got away with this. When I got tapped on the shoulder by an Olympic champion, said, that was pitched just the right level, that was for us. And I was, with fundamentals first, get it, remind people of the basics, and that can be really helpful rather than just doing the fancy stuff.
Eddie Jones challenged us all before the Japan World Cup. It's always did. And there's lots of mixed views at the moment around Eddie. But one thing you can certainly say is he challenges you to be better. And he was always, what can you do better? How are you going to move the dial in your department? So with nutrition, I remember sitting there thinking, there really isn't much new here. We got challenged at a conference to what's the biggest advancement in the last 10 years, and a lot of us are sat there like, what are we going to say? And that really sums up where the state of the literature is. But yeah, Eddie challenges what's new. The only thing I could think of was, how do we implement what we know better? So you take creatine, for example. I still think that's probably our best researched, well-established supplement. Yet you go into an elite rugby environment and you'd be surprised how many people aren't taking it. And why aren't they taking it? Because everybody wants the next best thing.
Yeah, okay.
Even if what the existing best is better. So what I tried to do for that Japan World Cup was come up with what we will do better as a nutrition department is the implementation science. Not necessarily any new innovation, but the innovation will come from implementing it better. And I think we got some big wins on that during that World Cup.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. So that might kill kind of some of the key questions I want to ask you about what's new. But maybe you can... But yeah, let's try it anyway. So I think one of the things that it'd be good to kind of cover off if you don't mind, and maybe if I give you two scenarios, endurance and resistance training.
Yep.
Resistance training, I guess, can encompass strength and size. Broad, I know, but I think it would be useful just to sort of go down some of those avenues. What isn't new? What is fundamental? It'd be great for you to capture some of that. Let's go endurance first, and whether that is macronutrient, micro, take your call. If you went into a club and thought that's missing, or they're not doing this, they're not even doing the fundamentals right, what are those things that you'd be looking for?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, I think we've got very confused in the literature and in our applied work by not fully understanding the difference between recreational, elite, and super elite. Now, me and you have been in a very fortunate position over our years that we've probably, not many people have worked with all three, and we know the difference. I don't know if you saw that paper that just came out by Louise, Jamie Whitfield, and John Hawley, and it was in the FRBM series that they do as an Olympic series, Free Radical Biology and Medicine. And I think the title is something like The Race Within a Race. And they were trying to show the difference between elite, super elite, and recreational. But surprisingly showed the complete lack of data on that super elite. And the number that jumps out at me is things like during event carbohydrate. There's probably only about 100 observations, and I don't mean 100 studies. It was something like less than 5% of studies were on elite. And then when you look at the number of participants, less than 100. So there's less than 100 observations on during event carbohydrate in elite. So the first thing I would say is that the literature base isn't really there at the elite end. The reason I'm contextualizing it with that is, if you was to say to me what isn't there, at the very elite end, I'd say it's the carbohydrate intake. Now, I don't think that's as important for a club runner, but if you're trying to get a sub 2:30 marathon, we're going to have to get your in-game carbohydrate fueling right. If you don't, I think the science is really clear. If what you want to do is run a 4-hour marathon at a PB, well, just train a bit more. Just do a few more runs. And I don't think nutrition at that point is as cutting edge as what it would be at the super elite end. So from the endurance side, I would say it's that. The other thing is this growing appreciation about underfueling, and the importance. We've all got very obsessed with being lean, which to an extent is useful in ultra endurance, but not at the expense of underfueling. And so I would say they're the two big rocks. Are we fueling it correctly? And are we getting the carbohydrate provision right? And then obviously, your other big rock there is your protein. We still often see people more at the recreational level of protein intake, about the 1 gram per kg body mark, and we know that that's going to be much better, even in an endurance aspect, if we get closer to 1.5 grams. So protein, carbohydrate, and total fueling, and that's almost like you're giving the basic talk to the elite athletes, but it's still the same, Steve.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say in-game nutrition, I'm assuming you're not just talking about in a race, but that being important to fuel the execution of the race.
Correct.
But in-game, I guess you're talking that idea and this concept of performance meals or performance days, where you're actually trying to fuel the delivery of key training sessions and recovery from.
Absolutely. That concept of fuel for the work required. So if you take, I know I was talking endurance, but if I move to something like a team sport, a football, for example, people often over worry about that pre-game meal, where actually the key day is the day before. Have we got around about the 6 to 8 grams per kilogram body mass of carbohydrate that game day -1 to load ourselves ready to go? And then the game day meal can be a little bit lighter, so we're not sitting heavy and it's not giving any gastrointestinal issues. The challenge we've got in 2024 is the social media world of people jumping around and saying, you don't need carbohydrates. Look at me, I'm perfectly lean and I don't eat carbohydrate. And you're like, yeah, great. But you're not trying to play 90 minutes football at the distance that Premier League players cover, or you're not trying to run a sub 2:30 marathon. And, unfortunately, I don't think these people have got the academic training to understand that it isn't a one size fits all. And whilst that ultra low carbohydrate model might work for recreationally active overweight trying to get leaner, good luck trying to be elite on that type of approach.
It is incredible that a fit bloke or lady that just looks fit, that people are inferring elite performance from that.
Yeah.
This mode and this program got me lean and built, and therefore this must apply to everybody who's trying to pursue some sort of athletic performance. It's incredible.
Incredible. A good friend of mine, he's got a really well respected personal training business, and at the time he was a conditioner for an elite rugby club. And he was one of these, I don't know if you call them fitness models as well, but appears on cover models, and he's probably the best physique I've ever seen. But getting ready for that photo shoot, he did not have the energy to run the water bottles on for the team he was working for. So the irony is that you're on the front cover of what are called men's health style magazines, and there's virtually nothing healthy about how that person looks. So for that one day to look ripped to the bone, literally not got the energy to jog on the field with a water bottle. And I don't think people realise that there's a world of difference between eating to look in that physique and eating to fuel athletic performance.
This episode of Supporting Champions podcast is sponsored by Athlete Now, the perfect platform for sports practitioners looking to expand their reach. Whether you're a sports scientist, therapist, or coach, Athlete Now helps you showcase your expertise, connect you directly with athletes, and grow your business. With no ads, no commissions, and access to industry discounts, is designed to make your services stand out. Join as a practitioner today to get listed, promote your services, and connect with athletes who need your support. And for athletes, it's free to sign up, giving you access to exclusive discount deals and direct connections with the best in the industry. Visit theathletenow.com to find out more. I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole of ranting about that, couldn't we? Let me go back to one of the points you made there about fueling enough, and so that you're not under fueling. But can you reconcile that against the idea of having days where there is carbohydrate restriction?
Yeah. So, look, we know that protein is going to be, we're going to need that pretty standard. And the world I tend to work in rugby, we clamp that about the 2 grams per kilogram body mass mark. Fat, we generally keep around about the 1 gram per kilogram, and that's pretty standard as well. And that normally comes with the meats and things like this. So now we've got 1 macronutrient left to manipulate, because the other 2 we've clamped at a constant. Now, some days within an elite rugby environment, the energy expenditure is going to be as low as 2,500 to 3,000. Other days, it's going to be as high as 5,000 to 6,000. So all we can do now is manipulate that 3rd macronutrient. And actually that works, because on the days when you need the higher expenditure is the days when you're training the host down and we need to fuel for work required. If we was to always eat on that high intensity training day, well then actually most of the days of the week we're probably 2,000 calories over expenditure. And you do that over the course of a season, you're going to end up with overweight players. So a model that a lot of people use now is this traffic lighting system, red, amber, green. So what we do a lot with the sports that I work with is meal by meal, I will classify that as a red, amber or green meal. So if you get into England Rugby on match day -1, every single meal is classed as green. High carbohydrate, we're loading for the day, the game the day after. If you come in on a very low intensity walkthrough style day, what you'll find is you see a lot of red meals. The other thing that we're beginning to realise now is this concept that deliberate training in a low carb state could actually drive the endurance phenotype. So we've done studies here again from JMU where, and it's not just here, it's some great stuff done out of Copenhagen and other international laboratories, that if you do some training in a low carb state, we see increased markers of mitochondrial biogenesis. And that's probably because it's causing a greater stress to the cell, and we've got now this adaptation. So there is some advantages to doing some deliberate carbohydrate restricted training, but that has to be within a well-designed periodized plan.
And any particular tips around that? Is that something you do fasted from the morning? You'd cap the duration of that type of work. What's any tips around if people are trying that carbohydrate restriction? What would you do? What would you suggest?
Yeah, there's multiple models to do it. You know, people have looked at the training twice a day model, where you'll do a morning session, only refeed at the end of that with protein, and then your second session is in a deliberate low carbohydrate muscle glycogen state. The key to it, and this is what people forget, is an overnight fast. If you're well fed in carbohydrate, an overnight fast will not reduce muscle glycogen. It will reduce liver glycogen, but it will take some degree of exercise to mobilize muscle glycogen. So if we want to do it, what we need to have done is a session that reduces muscle glycogen and then not replace it. So another way to do it might be that you do an evening session, let's say a Monday evening, you'll do a session where you've got some repeat sprints to reduce muscle glycogen. You only refuel with protein, wake up in the morning, know you will be in a low muscle glycogen state. You do that second session under-fueled to drive the adaptation, and then refeed on the back of it with your carbohydrate to get you back to where you want to be. Few caveats to that is that the coaching staff need to be on board, because performance could be down a little bit, and also you're not going to break any PBs, so the athletes need to be aware that the purpose of that session is to drive adaptations, not to actually get a PB.
Yeah, interesting. And so that could be something you could quantify quite easily. And if it was, say, for example, a steady run for an endurance athlete, but for game-based play, there needs to be a bit of a broader consideration in terms of just your repeated sprint ability or the speed of play, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. The other caveat to add to that is that most of the data on the low-carb enhancing mitochondrial biogenesis is in the sub-elite. We've not really done it in the fittest of the fit, but that's always going to be very hard to do, because now we've got to start getting biopsies out of elite athletes. And, I'm very proud of, I once managed that from rugby players. Probably the hardest study I've ever done, when I managed to convince a professional rugby team to let me take muscle biopsies from them. But it's not the easiest thing to do.
What was the sell there? How did you get that one across the line? Did you say, hey, guys, you're looking built at the moment. Let's take a bit of this muscle off you?
do you know what the sell was? And it was actually, my PhD student at the time was James Moorhen, who's now taken over from me at England Rugby. James was working as the Widnes Vikings nutritionist. And because of his relationship, that the players were really invested in him as an individual. They knew that he cared about them. I think they actually cared about him enough to say, yeah, we'll be part of your study, and
like a GoFundMe page. Yeah, donate your muscle.
Yeah, it's the relationship building, I would say. But also, we did explain why we're doing it and what the advantage was. And actually, I got a phone call only a couple of weeks ago from one of the participants in that study, and that was nearly a decade ago. And this player is now playing in the lower divisions. And I was really happy that he phoned me to ask me advice on something nutritionally. And of course, I'm going to help him. He gave me some muscle for my greatest ever study. But I think everything in this life is about relationships and being nice, and what goes around comes around.
So, yeah, I love that. Can I just go back to the carbohydrate role then?
Yeah.
Manipulation of carbohydrate. This phrase that you've got in some of your publications, carbohydrate is king. And I suppose the implication there is not necessarily fat. In terms of those high-fat diets,
Yes.
that phase, would it be worth just unpacking that one?
And again, it gets back to this context again. So we're talking about at the elite end here. We're talking about if you want to run a fast marathon, if you want to perform optimally for 80 minutes in a team sport event. Well, we know that despite there being a almost unlimited store of fat, then the intensity that we're able to use that fuel at is not the intensity we need to get these elite performances. The maths just doesn't add up. It's all been mathematically modeled. You are not going to run these PBs. And actually, the secret to eventually doing the sub 2 hour marathon legitimately without the pacing and without the cars providing drinks at the side. So one day when we do it, it's going to be about driving the carbohydrate intake during performance, probably north of 110 to 120 grams per hour. It's the only way we're going to fuel it. We're not going to fuel that on fats. Now, if you want to go and do a 5 hour marathon, then I don't really think it matters, and then carbohydrate isn't king. But at that elite end, we've tried it, and look, I've seen the argument being that we've not allowed people to adapt for long enough, and if you eventually you will adapt. Well, I've seen studies dragged out to 8 to 10 weeks now, and it's still showing performance is impaired with a low carb, high fat diet. Now, I don't know how many weeks I could convince a coach to let me have impaired performance before, at best, we go back to being equal. And Luke, I don't want to turn this into a real criticism of the high fat approach, but the study that everyone cites that is the best evidence that there's an improvement in performance on a high fat diet. When you actually get into, the Jeff Volek studies, when you get into that study, it's on 5 people. 2 people did better, 2 people did worse, and 1 didn't change. So against the backdrop of hundreds of studies showing that the carbohydrate enhances performance, we've got this study where 2 people did better. So we really do need to interpret that with some degree of caution.
Okay, so you're gracious enough there to say, hey, let's not rule it out, but at the moment the evidence just doesn't look like it's strong or prevailing.
I will always say that. One thing I've learned over the years, and this is why you'll never see me on social media saying, that's idiotic, that's stupid, they've got this wrong, is that, the great thing about science is that it keeps evolving. And I like that phrase, to the best of our knowledge with the current literature base, this is where I think the literature is. Now, that's not to say it won't change. So I still remember when I was at university, I was being taught that we didn't need more protein than 0.8 grams per kg. And you come forward 20 years and we realise that was completely wrong. I'm seeing it a little bit on creatine at the moment, that we were quite dismissive about creatine acutely because we knew we had to load on it. And now there's a little bit of literature coming about the potential mental aspect of acute creatine. So some nice work by Eric Rawson coming out in that world. So we do always need to be humble. And as a scientist, I do like the phrase that I don't mind being wrong, but I don't want to be wrong for a day longer than I need to be. So, I will give you the best advice. I don't mind changing my mind. I don't need to be a politician where it's embarrassing to do a U-turn. If the evidence changes, I'm gone. But at the moment, the science really does push towards, in the world of the elite, carbohydrate is king.
Yeah. Okay, so you allude to protein intake, and maybe if we could just do that part and tap into the fundamentals there, but also, let's switch our attention to kind of resistance training and strength potentially as the focus. I mean, we've addressed sort of size in other podcasts a little bit, so whether that's worth flagging, I don't know. But the role of protein in acquiring high levels of strength, and how has that literature evolved, and where are we at the moment?
Okay, brilliant. If you don't mind, before we get to protein, because I was doing a bit of digging. There's a paper that came out 2 years ago I think people missed, and the title was something like "Energy Deficiency Impairs Resistance Training Gains." And it was a meta-analysis.
So are we talking about carbohydrate role for?
We're talking about energy in total now.
Right, interesting.
And the reason I highlight that is a lot of people come to me and say, I want to gain muscle mass, but I also want to drop fat mass. Now, whilst theoretically this is possible, I believe, practically I think it's a nightmare. So people trying to put on the muscle mass, but not eating enough. Now, if I remember right, that meta-analysis said it didn't affect strength under fueling. You can still get stronger, but you might not necessarily get the lean mass that you want. And I've seen this a lot in looking back over years where I've been involved in, let's say, rugby teams where we're trying to get size on a young player, but also they're trying to get fitter, they're training the house down, and physically they can't consume enough food because of the training they're doing. And there's an argument to say at that point, if the gains in size is the key, should we try and back off a little bit on their on feet work? And There are some suggestions in the literature, and I'd like to do much more work in this, about there being a theoretical maximum amount of nutrition that the gut can actually take and process within a day. So it's all well and good trying to get, okay, we'll just feed them more, we'll get them to 7,000 calories. But how much of that are we actually able to deal with? So the first thing I would say when it comes to lean mass is, are we eating enough food? Then we can move to protein. Again, we pontificate between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. I don't think anyone thinks that what under 1.6 is a good idea. And I've not seen many people who would say greater than 2.2 is needed. So we're somewhere between them two numbers. In reality, when you work with, particularly with team sport athletes, most end up about the 2 gram per kilogram body mass anyway. And that's where I tend to aim, and I've not seen any evidence to say that that is either A, harmful, or B, not enough. There was the one manuscript by Sam Metler, the late, great Kevin Tipton, being the lead author on it. And that was a suggestion that if you're trying to preserve muscle mass in a calorie deficit, then ramping your protein intake to about 2.2 might be a good thing. So that's where the top end is 2.2. I'd say the bottom end's about 1.6, and we want to get somewhere in between. But the other key factor on that is the suggestion, and again, I know there's controversy here, but the suggestion that protein intake should be split evenly throughout the day. And a big mistake a lot of people tend to do is backload the day. So they've not got up in time for a good breakfast, they've had a lunch on the rush, and then they do get somewhere near the protein intake, but all in one big meal. And the balance of the evidence, I'm using that again to the best of my knowledge at the moment, is that we need to split that evenly, probably like 0.4 grams per kilogram body mass per meal, 4 to 5 times a day.
Okay, so summarizing that, for if I've heard you correctly, then let's not even really start talking about sophisticated nutritional strategies until you're actually eating enough. If you're in deficit, then there's going to be a stripping aspect, or it's going to be harder to build. Potentially the mechanisms of strength-based development might be that you're getting neural adaptation, connective tissue strengthening that comes from other sources other than protein acquisition. But ultimately you've got to fuel it. You've got to fuel that calorie surplus to build muscle. Then there's a sweet spot around that sort of 2 grams per kilo.
Yep.
So it's not an absolute figure, it's a relative figure to your body mass. And the upgrade there is, if you want to do that really well, you're going to need to prime the signal and the stimulus of nutrient interacting with the sort of cell communicators frequently through the day.
What a summary. Absolutely spot on. And then the final thing I would add on that, and it's moving away from nutrition back to more physiology and my S&C, is, that paper back in 2005, Priscilla Clarkson was the last author on it, about that huge variability in muscle size and strength after resistance training, with the suggestion being that massive genetic component. But you give people the same training, you give them the same diet, and over a period of weeks, some people gained muscle and some people lost it. And we see it all the time, don't we, in the elite end, that there's some people only need to go in a gym once or twice and they get huge. I've even been in situations with elite rugby teams where there's some players who don't like to lift weights because they think they get too big too quickly. So all the strength work just comes from body weight and actual just the training, where other people have to fight like mad in the gym, really put a shift in to maintain that hypertrophy that they've spent years developing. And then at the end of their careers, it completely goes. So I think we're going to know learn much and much more over coming years about that genetic component.
Yeah, that's interesting. That and I potentially can see this as the big next area to individualize. These are the average suggestions. This is the program that tends to work, that tends to get you to the Olympic level, the Olympic champion level. This is the template and the blueprint that's helped people before. But there's some margins of adaptation. The percentage improvements for some people have been different, and therefore you've got to think about different ways of approaching your nutrition and your training.
But individualization is something, and it goes back to me saying getting to know the person. And as I say, you don't mind me doing this. I don't think I go off on tangents, but it got me thinking about ice baths and what we're beginning to understand.
Don't get me started on ice baths, Graeme. I've been campaigning for 25 years now.
Okay, so I'll give you what I mean by ice baths. So, getting to know the individual. So there's some nice literature out there now about the cognitive appraisal of a given task affecting the physiology. So whether you perceive that to be adverse or pleasant, through the effect it has on hormonal response, will actually change physiology. So if we said that on average an ice bath might improve recovery, let's just go with it for now on that statement. If I've got an individual who tells me I hate them and I feel worse when I get out and I feel worse the day after, why am I forcing that individual into an ice bath? When actually their cognitive appraisal of that task, the fact that they hate being cold, could actually cause a change in stress hormones and actually could delay their recovery. Why does my mean in an academic paper trump knowing that individual? And we go even more extreme than this, and I won't mention a name, but I had one player who he didn't realise it, but speaking to me, he used to get a bit of a vasovagal response to ice baths, so I actually feel like going to pass out. 10 minutes to go in a game, started worrying about the ice bath because it was compulsory. What are we doing? What are we doing where we've got something where we think is going to help somebody and actually is more likely to impair and is now actually impairing match day performance because we're beginning to worry about it in games. And it gets back to that. Got to know the individual, and we've got to have these conversations.
Yeah. That's bonkers, that is, isn't it? I mean, I've been guilty of it myself. You push hydration for hot, warm weather training camps or at altitude or whatever it might be, and you've got some nutrition, some hydration-based scores that you're trying to get people to work towards, and then people have got disrupted sleep or that they they're elevated heart rate because they need a wee. It's like what have we done?
Yeah, well, I teach all my students that the first question when you get some information off an athlete is the why. So, and we had that again within one of the elite rugby teams I was working with, where a player first thing in the morning was consistently dehydrated on the urine tests, and I said, let's find out why. And you speak to him, and the why is, well, Luke, when I get the scores that you want me to have first thing in the morning, I'm up twice in the night for a pee, and I feel worse. So actually, I was like, well, that's a perfectly reasonable reason why your first pee is a bit dehydrated. Now, providing we've rehydrated you well enough for the time you start training, there's not a problem there. But I've known teams where even things like fine structures come in for people who aren't hydrated in a morning. So now what we're doing is disrupting the sleep. And the more we understand about sleep, the more we realise that, sleep has got such a key component of the immune system. So actually, in an attempt to get somebody to hit a metric on a urine osmometer, we're probably compromising their immune system. What are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah, science and practice first rather than actually trying to get the holistic kind of development. Yeah. Let's jump to supplements, can we? And what works, and I think probably you phrased this, if I'm not mistaken, traditional supplements, which I think is quite twee, of basically saying traditional, as in don't forget these ones.
Yeah.
It's like it's sort of it's the basics, as you say. There's some, like you mentioned creatine, but creatine was all about us, wasn't it, previously? And then we just sort of forgot about it. It's just not as fashionable. But it doesn't mean that it's not stop. It's actually stopped being effective. So could you take us through some of the key ones and how people can tap into that as a source for, again, elite performance execution?
Yeah. And the good thing is, when you think about it the way you've just asked me to think about it, there actually aren't that many.
Yeah.
So my industry, the sport nutrition world, came up with this term food first, a food first approach to sport nutrition. And that's why we wrote that manuscript a few years ago now called Food First but Not Food Only, a pragmatic approach to sport supplements. And that's because if you go on a strict, well, what people thought was a strict definition of food first, which is food only, that meant we can't give any supplements at all. And we do know that there's a handful with proven benefits. And if we go down a food only approach, my worry then is your athletes start looking outside of you for advice, because somebody in the backstreet gym is now allowed to give them better advice than I can give. You're putting me in a straitjacket, not allowing me to do my job.
Can I just ask you about that?
Yeah.
And what's your sense as to why that is? Is that because ultimately for elite performance, it's difficult to get the amount and volume and breadth of nutrition in to fuel and support elite performance?
Yeah. So in that manuscript, we came up with 6 criteria whereby actually supplementation is not only useful but could be beneficial to health or performance. So some nutrients being difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities in food. So creatine, beta-alanine are 2 examples there. Yes, they're found in food, but you'd need about 1 kilogram of raw chicken per day to get enough creatine out of a food-only approach. And we know that creatine's got a big test. Other things, we said things like some nutrients are hard to eat during or close to competition. So yes, in theory, you could have a banana mid-game in a football match to get 20, 30 grams of carbohydrate. It's going to be hard to eat a banana mid-game, but a little carbohydrate shot may help. Some things are just not found high enough in the diet, even as part of a regular diet. So vitamin D. If you live in the UK, most of our vitamin D is from sunlight, and in the winter months, we're not going to get it. Some people are fussy eaters, don't like eating fish, don't eat oily fish. So there could be an omega-3 deficiency. And then convenience is another one. So we talk about protein. If I've got a 50 kilo runner on 2 grams per kilogram, that's 100 grams of protein spread evenly through the day, 4 25-gram hits, really easy. If I've got a 130 kilo rugby player who needs 260 grams, then actually they become a competitive eater and they don't even have time to train. So there is where a protein supplement may help. So I do agree that we've got to get the food right first. But then on top of that, I think you can make a good case where some supplements may be beneficial. So I'm trying to think back now to my days when I was hands on the tools with England Rugby and what we did on a daily basis. Well, on a daily basis, we provided them with 5 pills. That's all. People might think it's a lot more. It was a vitamin D in the winter months. It was a probiotic. I think there's growing evidence about the gut microbiome. There was omega-3s. And then the 2 that were a little bit on the cusp of, do I really believe it? Well, I think there's enough evidence to help us, but I could change my mind, was turmeric and a multivitamin. And that was it. That was all we did from a pill perspective. Then on top of that, there was whey-based protein and there was collagen-based protein. Collagen, because of the Keith Barr work on collagen, on tendon and ligament support. And then we had creatine and beta-alanine. And I think that was about it. So when you ask me which supplements do I think work, I think I've probably just named them. Now, look, there'll be people listening to this saying that I'm an idiot and I forgot about X, Y, and Z. In my head these are the big wins. These are the ones that I can stand in front of you and justify. So if we get all these in and we get them in the right amounts at the right time, then actually I would prefer that than like a shotgun approach of giving 40 things and people are saying, I'm not taking all that. So we had a morning 5 pills, creatine, beta-alanine, and some protein. On top of that, I would add, if you're in some situations, the bicarbonate literature is coming back, the sodium bicarbonate, and particularly with the novel delivery mechanism now, we're in that sodium alginate form that reduces the gastrointestinal distress. So I think you could put bicarb in that list as well.
Quick tangent on bicarb then. Are you talking about it from a performance enhancement point of view, or the sort of David Bishop approach that used to be around about it augmenting and supporting your training delivery?
Great question. I think you could say both. But certainly if I was working in a sport where you're going to get that big buildup of hydrogen ions, or what we used to talk about, lactic acid, but let's get the terminology right, then I think the suggestion is that it's worth around about 4 seconds in a 2K rowing race. And if you think about what 4 seconds is for a 2K, that's the difference between winning a medal and not even being at the Olympics.
Yeah. Now, caffeine, creatine, beta-alanine, you've mentioned, vitamin D, some other funky ones like turmeric and multivit, which I guess, like you say, they might be less stable, but possibly not doing any harm. It maybe it's drifting towards the strengthening evidence. Probably put nitrates in there. You haven't mentioned nitrates, but I guess there's some growing evidence of the benefit there. I'm just interested to know what your thoughts are on the sort of ubiquitous aspect of this, because we've sort of split endurance and resistance training, and you've talked about sort of repeated sprint, but also repeated sprint, but muscular people. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on the idea of using creatine, which is classically for sort of repeated sprint, but potentially for endurance. I'm interested to get your thoughts on something like nitrates, which has got sort of famous for its impact upon blood flow and oxygenation, but how beneficial that could be to muscle recovery if ultimately you want to get blood to a repairing muscle. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how, if some of these fine supplements, whether that actually they underpin broad athletic performance regardless of the type.
So, you mentioned two things. First of all, I forgot to mention caffeine, so thank you for mentioning it, because caffeine is on it. The reason I didn't mention it is I'm trying to visualize my morning supplement table, and obviously I use caffeine then on game day, particularly in the chewing gum format because of the speed of delivery. But thanks for mentioning that. Nitrate we always had available, but nitrate was one of them where in the worlds that I work, athletes stopped using it. Why did they stop using it? Well, one, they're telling me they didn't feel a benefit, and two, particularly in the beetroot style stuff, the taste of it is just vile, isn't it? People have different tastes on it. But what I was finding in the worlds that I was working is it was out and it was available, but the uptake was very low, with the exception of the odd person. And actually, the evidence on it, as far as I can read, is really strong the less trained you are.
Okay.
And the more trained you are, the less convincing it is. And it's like, the initial suggestions on it was that it was a 10% improvement in performance. Whenever we see something like a 10%, I don't know about you, I'm like,
that's like that's a Lucozade level 33%.
Yeah, well, if you think about, and I pick rowing because it's a sport that still fascinates me, because I think it's like one of the pinnacles of being at the you finish that race and you collapse, don't you? There's not many. I like the Jurgen Grobel approach that you shouldn't have enough energy to pick your silver medal up. You've given it everything.
Everyone talks about different hardcore sports, and I've classed rowing in that it's using so much muscle, it's stretching the oxygen delivery that everything hurts. When you got on the bike and the legs hurt, with rowing everything hurts.
Everything hurts, yeah. So that's why I picked that as an example. If you think about a very good 2K of 5:40, well, 10% is 34 seconds, and now you're breaking world records. So if we did think that the nitrate was a genuine 10%, we could take a good club rower to be a world record holder just by giving him a bit of beetroot. Now, what we know is that at that elite end, well, I reckon a 0.5%. So what's that, like a 1.5 second? That's an unbelievable performance advantage. So I would always say just be careful of people when they read the science. If something's claiming to be 10%, the chances are that's not going to hold true at the elite end. But yeah, I think the oxygen delivery side of it is interesting. I did at one point speak with a farmer that I know about growing rhubarb, because obviously rhubarb's rich in nitrates, and I thought that would be a much more palatable drink. And this farmer actually grew a few fields of rhubarb for me and started sending me some rhubarb shots that we measured the nitrate in, and it was high. But yeah, I think again it's getting to the individual. That when I've spoke to players like, why don't you have that beta? It was like, well, I've not felt an advantage, and it made me feel sick. Okay, right. Well, then I'm happy to leave that one alone.
Yeah, not that it's not that it is common necessarily, but people saying I've stopped taking beetroot juice because it explodes the other end. Excuse the graphic nature of that, and so it just means I'm not going to do it. A bit like the bicarb disrupting gastro, and I think that's where ultimately I guess a nutritionist, physiologist can support people to say, okay, that protocol might not have worked for you. Let's try and find a protocol that potentially could.
Yeah, it's a good point, because what we have done with people who we think it might be strategically advantage is then get it into something. So we came up with something. If any of my England Rugby lads are listening to it, I don't know if you ever listen to, maybe I'll get them. We came up with what we called like Devil's Blood, because it did look like Devil's Blood because we beat it. And it was just for one or two players who did feel that it helped them. And it was a way of putting the beat into other things that made it taste more palatable. So we made it into like a bit of a game day smoothie where we actually, it sounds horrible, but we had some Greek yogurt, we had some berries and cherries and into a blender, and made like a combined polyphenol beetroot smoothie. And it tasted a bit of honey as well that takes the edge off it, and it made it much more palatable, and it improved its consumption. But the other thing is to warn people. I remember one player saying really panicking, he thought he'd damaged his kidneys because post game he was what he thought was peeing blood, but it was the nitrate, the beetroot staining the urine.
Mm. Yeah, I suppose that in itself could be just that practical nutrition application, isn't it? I remember the sort of formulating Powerade Pro prior to the Athens Olympics, and the idea of having 60 millimole sodium concentrations, 80 millimole sodium concentrations, of what was known in the literature with the Ron Morn studies and so on. No one's going to drink it. No one's going to drink it, and so that's why sports nutrition drinks are sort of 20 millimole, and maybe if we working with Coca-Cola at the time, of getting it to 40 millimole and it being palatable, and knowing that this is a hydration drink, it's that sweet spot of, I'll engage with this, I'll adhere with this, but it's okay, it's all right.
Yeah, we would, it's a great point, Matt, about how can we do it. So a few years ago, we're in warm weather training, and we're getting quite a few going down with cramp, and some even whole body cramp, which is interesting to observe the first time you observe it. And so you're quickly into the literature, and you're like, right, we don't know what's causing this. No, you can get 20 scientists in a room and they'll come out fighting of what causes cramp. But Ron is still convinced that sodium is a key player in it. So I spoke with my chef at the time, a brilliant chef. How can I get much more sodium into our players acutely? And we came up with these, for breakfast, some salted caramel overnight oats, where we could get 5 grams of pink Himalayan salt into these little salted caramel overnight oats. And they tasted mega. So in the morning, rather than saying, right, let's drink this salt water that tasted horrendous, people forget that with the sodium, it doesn't matter how it gets in. It doesn't have to be a drink. There's nothing magical. So, people asking me all the time about this new trend that drinking water is no good. It has to have electrolytes added. And you're forgetting the amount of sodium in the diet. And actually, if all you did was have a sodium-free diet and you drank sodium-free water, we might have an issue. But most people get plenty of salt in the diet. So we did these salted caramel overnight oats. And we also did these lemon and kiwi salt slammers. But we just, little shots of it. And look, it had a great effect. And we've seen, so whilst I'm still wouldn't like to hang my hat on what causes cramp, the fact that Ron Moore still is convinced that sodium's an issue, we tried it. Anecdotally, it was useful, but yeah, it's. I remember being at a conference once and somebody, the old analogy, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And she said, you can salt the hay. Put salt on the hay and it'll make the horse drink. Salt the hay, find a way. And that was her mantra, salt the hay, find a way. And that's the same as that. If I want to get more nitrate into somebody, I've got to find a way. I can't just say drink the shot. If I want to get more sodium in, I can't just say drink that horrible drink. I've got to salt the hay and find a way.
Love that. Hey, look, I could talk to you all day about this. I'd love to just tap your knowledge about novel compounds that you've sort of identified previously. A couple there that I'm not sure of the pronunciation of, so you can start with that point. But any novel compounds that you're identifying, you think this is worth keeping an eye on, with the usual disclaimer, with the probability of the literature and the current evidence. But what's anything that's emerging that is worth us keeping an eye on?
Yeah, we are a little bit constrained in nutrition compared with other disciplines, and it annoys me to an extent a little bit. But if you think about, if an S&C coach tries something innovative, whether it's blood flow restriction or whatever, they're being innovative. If a nutritionist comes in with a new compound, they're a cheat. Immediately you've got the anti-doping concern, haven't you? And the way WADA word a lot of the things, we've got to be really careful of going too novel, because of, if we're looking for something that's got anabolic properties to it, enhance the strength, well, obviously now we're under that aspect of it. If we're looking for something that's a stimulant, well, most of the stimulants apart from caffeine are prohibited. So it is a challenge in my world with novel. I got really excited about 2 years ago with CBD.
Okay.
Cannabidiol. Your challenger with cannabidiol is the way WADA has worded it. So WADA have removed CBD from the prohibited list, but left all other cannabinoids on. So what they've done is basically say, you can take this one compound, but actually it's impossible for you to take it, because you're always going to have trace amounts of the other cannabinoids in there. So I couldn't begin to experiment with that with athletes. I'm doing some work with non-athletes in my laboratory, and it does seem to be interesting.
And doing what?
From a multiple aspects of the literature: sleep, anxiety. So it'll help with sleep if the sleep is anxiety related, and then we're looking at it from a pain perspective as well. Because I think the way sport is going now, particularly contact sports, anything that can help with pain management is a big thing. We've got to stop our athletes becoming dependent on opioid-based painkillers. So if we can find an alternate way, which is what I'm interested in with CBD, but it's just impossible to try at the moment, I'm afraid, because of the way WADA word it. the new kid on the block are all these mushrooms. So these what being termed functional mushrooms. I've not seen and then other things like ashwagandha and that. I've not seen anything yet to convince me that the science is strong enough for me to bring it into a system, but I'm open-minded. And then there's the emergence of these novel peptides, but that worries me because it's anything that's showing anabolic-like properties in the novel peptides, then we're in an anti-doping violation. And when it comes to the anti-doping, I don't mind admitting I sit on the very cautious side of normal, which probably explains why I use so few supplements at the elite end.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. And so would you put something like HMB, hydroxymethyl butyrate, into that anabolic angle?
No, I think HMB, which is basically just a derivative of leucine, would be all right. Again, most of the literature on that is coming from one group, and some of the suggestions that it improves strength more than any steroid paper ever published makes you look at it with a pinch of salt. I know the likes of Stu Phillips, who I've got massive respect for from the strength and protein side, has always been quite dismissive of HMB, so it's not one that I've gone down. But you're right, there is a little bit of evidence. But it's a bit like ZMA. The only real paper showing ZMA works is by Victor Conte, the person who owns the patent on it, and obviously quite famous for the Balco laboratory. So again, that's not something that I bring into my toolbox because I'm not yet convinced that there's enough evidence. Look, any supplement, you've always got this risk and reward. There's always a risk. Even with informed sport, we've got a risk. So I will only introduce ones where in that risk-reward balance, I'm happy that the reward outweighs the risks.
Love it. Graeme, fantastic to talk to you. So practical yet comprehensive in your knowledge base. Hope you don't mind me saying, pretty inspiring to listen to you riffing off so many different topics today. Thanks so much for taking the time to have a conversation with me.
It's been really enjoyable, and these conversations always leave me inspired as well to do more. A few things you've said today has given me ideas for research studies as well.
Oh yeah, so, come on, I want a co-authorship on that one then.
Love to. Yeah, I'd love to.
Great. Cheers, Graeme.
Anytime.
Hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you did, please take a chance to press like and subscribe to the channel. And for audio, please do leave a review. Thank you.